Welcome, everybody. You should be able to see the slides now that I've prepared, and it should say sleep and tinnitus, essentially. So in today's session, I will talk about insomnia. What is it? What does it look like? What does sleep look like? For a start, then I will talk about what regulates our sleep, what makes us sleep, and what can stop our sleep. And then finally, I will discuss the various ways in which we can manage our sleep difficulties in the context of tinnitus. So sleep problems are very common. About 40% of adults report some kind of difficulty with sleep, which is clearly a lot. Now that varies. Not all of these 40% of people would say that they've got insomnia, and not much fewer, of course, would qualify for a diagnosis of insomnia. So there's a difference in how sleep seems to affect people depending on their age. So in young adults, it's mostly the problem of falling asleep, whereas in older adults, it's mainly the sleep maintenance, the problem. And we can sort of think about why that might be, because, well, young adults, they may be much more engaged with, media and just evening activities that might interfere with their sleep, including the use of alcohol. Now, it's actually much more common in women, and it's also more common in people who are unemployed, separated, and living alone. And perhaps one of the reasons for that is just lacking structure in the day that then interferes with the ability to have a routine evening and nighttime. And it's, of course, much more common in shift workers and can still be measured in terms of effects many years afterwards, even if they have stopped working shifts. Now, there are different... sorry, I think I've skipped a slide here. So there we go. So what is insomnia? Insomnia is really the diagnosis of sleep difficulties that has reached a certain level. And to make that diagnosis, a few things need to be present. So there needs to be, first and foremost, the subjective complaint about poor sleep. So people may have all the below, but if they're happy with their sleep, they will not get a diagnosis of insomnia. They need to have a problem with either the maintenance of sleep, that would be actually staying asleep once they've gone to bed and fallen asleep for the first time, or the actually falling asleep in the first place. They need to have the sleep onset needs to be delayed by at least 30 minutes. That would qualify as delayed onset. And this needs to be present for at least 3 days a week. And most people have very varying levels of sleep. Some days they sleep very well, or better than others at least. And in some days they may sleep hardly at all. This needs to be present for at least 6 months before a diagnosis is made. And it should, based on self-report measures, affect how the person is affected during their day. Now, the causes of insomnia can be very varied. So there are biological factors that could interfere with sleep, and that could include pain, such as migraine or other bodily pain. It could include breathing problems. It could include angina, or a whole variety of other biological factors. Psychological factors are another reason that might cause insomnia, and that includes emotional crisis or chronic stress. Drugs may also affect insomnia, and that includes alcohol and sleeping medication, but also, of course, other drugs, such as excessive use of stimulants. Disturbing environment and bad habits, another factor that often impacts on our ability to sleep, and that could include having too much light on, using the TV, uncomfortable beds, or sleeping in inappropriate places such as the sofa. And then finally, conditioning. So by conditioning, we mean that one of the main reasons that ultimately underlies our sleep difficulties, maybe behaviors and thoughts that we might adopt in order to cope with the insomnia that then ultimately mean that we maintain our problem. And conditioning, really, I'll talk more about that, what that actually means. And essentially, it means that we no longer associate being in bed with sleep and sleeping. And that can have a variety of problems, as I'll talk about in a moment. So why do we even sleep? And that might be one of the first questions that one might ask. It's not actually that clear why people sleep at all. And lots of different hypotheses have been put forward, but generally speaking, the idea is that sleep restores or preserves energy. People generally feel bad when they don't sleep very well, but it's actually fairly difficult to prove some of these things in terms of what actually happens during the night. Healthy sleep is, of course, associated with feeling well, good mental health, but there's also physiological signs of better sleep, such as better body weight, obviously safety issues in terms of operating machinery or driving. And there may be also some evidence that it's linked to preventing infections through our increased immune system. Now, most of the time, what we do during the day is unaffected by how much we sleep. And here I'm talking about the insomnia that we might be talking about here. So most of the time, even if people are only sleeping 1, 2, 3 hours a day, they're still able to do most of the tasks that are required of them. Only when we see sleep deprivation that goes to an extreme level, such as stopping people from sleeping, say, 30 hours, will then see an effect on people's ability to be creative and to perform various tasks that are necessary during the day. But of course, 30 hours of sleep deprivation is a very long time. And this is generally what is created in the lab experiment when people actually are stopped from sleeping. Now, what we also see is that the adverse effects from insomnia and not sleeping are reversed by relatively short periods of sleep. So even if you have been kept awake for 30 hours, you will not then sleep for twice as long. You will regain much of your well-being in a relatively short period of time. But worry about sleep is very common, and it is a massive source of stress for many people. Now, when it comes to tinnitus, actually, it probably is not a surprise, and certainly not a surprise to those who are in this call today, that sleep difficulties are very common in people who have got tinnitus. About 50% of people with tinnitus report difficulties with sleep. Now, the good side of that, obviously, is that means 50% of people who have tinnitus sleep well. And I have seen thousands of patients as in my daily role, and I can definitely attest to that. Some people have no problems with sleep, no matter what their tinnitus is like, which seems almost unexplainable to people who've got tinnitus and who sleep poorly. But it clearly does happen, and we've also, of course, seen how people get better sleep over time, even if they have tinnitus, and the tinnitus hasn't changed. Now, let's say a few things about what a sleep actually look like. Some of you may know this, but there's actually lots of different things happening when we sleep. And these are, you can see on the graph on the right-hand side to the top, these are brain waves, so electrical waves going through the brain. And what we see is that when we are awake, so that's the top bar, there's a lot of activity there, and the brain is clearly very active. And then we have 4 different stages of sleep. And bar by bar, you can see how the brain activity changes. So we have what is called N1, so the first stage of sleep, which you see the waves having a very different shape. And as you go further down in the sleep architecture, if you go to stage 2 and stage 3 is the deep sleep, you see very slow waves, yes, which is suggesting that there's these slow waves going across the brain in deep sleep phases. Now, there's another stage, which is the REM sleep, which is actually the rapid eye movement sleep. And it kind of says it already in the name. Rapid eye movement is when actually the eyes are flickering and the eyelids are moving. This is actually a state of sleep where the brain is relatively more active. So if you compare the waves that you have in REM, they're actually looking fairly similar to the brain waves that we see during the awake stage. And indeed, it seems to be the time of the night where the brain is most active. Most of the very vivid dreams most dreams that are intense seem to occur in that stage of the sleep. Now, if you look at the very bottom bar here, what we can see is that actually, and I hope you can still make that out on the slide, we start out being awake, and as the line then goes from left to right, we dip down into the stage 1 sleep. And stage 1 sleep, it's really dipping in and out of sleep. We don't spend a lot of time in that stage at all. We spend a little bit more time in stage 2 sleep, and then we go into deep sleep. And the first deep sleep phase is at the beginning of the night, and you can see here that this period lasts for quite a long time. Surprisingly, what happens then is people naturally come out of that deep sleep phase, and they actually almost kind of become awake. At least that's what it looks like on the brainwave measurements, that they're awake. And you can see, if you look at that graph, that actually we wake up various times during the night. And this is completely normal. The brain looks like that for almost all individuals on average, of course. So we go through these different cycles. They all last about 90 minutes long. As the night goes on, we spend less and less time in really deep sleep, and we spend more time in the much shallower stage 2 sleep. And maybe we also spend a little bit more time in the REM sleep, so the time of the night where we do all our dreaming. Now, the key pieces of information here are that it's completely normal to wake up. Everybody wakes up during the night. Some people, when they wake up, they go to the toilet. Some people, they turn around in bed. They don't even notice that they're awake. But essentially, everybody wakes up. Now, for people with tinnitus, the waking up phases may look a little bit different. You may wake up and you notice the tinnitus. And that might interfere with the ability to go back to sleep. Perhaps the tinnitus is very loud, and you don't go back to sleep. Now, the question is, and it's very difficult to answer the question, have you been woken up by the tinnitus? Or was it just a natural awakening and then you started noticing the tinnitus? Now, it's difficult to know what is really happening here, but it's completely normal to wake up during the night and to wake up multiple times. The problem is really that if there's a difficulty of falling asleep again. My mouse has just given up on me. Okay, good, I've recovered. So the next question is, we've looked at the sleep architecture. What is actually making us fall asleep? So there are two factors really that are driving us to sleep. And one of those is what we call the 24-hour body clock. And this 24-hour body clock is mainly influenced by light, but it's also influenced by physical activity, so movement. This, you can see this factor as being an important influence on whether you sleep or you don't sleep, just when you go to a different time zone. Yeah, if you move from the UK to Japan, you'll be in a totally different time zone, and your 24-hour body clock needs some time to adjust. That's why most people will have difficulties falling asleep at night when they go to Japan, or if they go from Australia to America or from America to Europe or vice versa. This 24-hour body clock needs some time to adjust. And melatonin is one of those factors involved in this body clock because of the sunlight. This is one of the main drivers for sleep, although it is said that actually melatonin is just something that signifies when we should go to sleep. It's not actually something that it makes us go to sleep and makes us stay asleep. It is actually just a signal that actually now it's time to go to sleep. So this is actually released as sunlight fades. So when it's dark, melatonin, the hormone melatonin gets released in the brain and signifies to our body that it's time to sleep. The other factor is what is called the homeostatic sleep drive, or otherwise called sleep pressure. And sleep pressure is basically another chemical called adenosine that is building up in the body all the time that we are awake. So as soon as we are awake, adenosine builds up, and it keeps increasing until we fall asleep again. And when we fall asleep, or when we are asleep, the adenosine level is decreasing. The sleep pressure or the sleep drive is reducing. So this keeps building up and eventually will make us go to bed. It just depends on how long we've been awake for. So on the next slide, you can see a little bit what is happening. And here we've got a graph that shows, 7 o'clock in the morning, which is commonly when people get up. For all the time that we are awake, the sleep pressure is increasing. I think maybe you can see now my cursor here on the slideshow. The sleep pressure is increasing. As we go to sleep, and in this case here, it's 11 o'clock at night, the adenosine level is decreasing. And then when we wake up again, the adenosine level is increasing again in the body. And eventually, it will increase the sleep pressure to such an extent that we will fall asleep. Now, I mentioned the circadian rhythm just before, this 24-hour body clock. Now, what you see here is the effect of the circadian rhythm on wakefulness. Actually, when we wake up, we are generally not most awake from the basis of our circadian rhythm. What is very low is the sleep pressure. So the sleep pressure, this adenosine level is very low, but from a circadian rhythm perspective, we're not actually most awake. This sense of wakefulness actually increases all the way until we tend to go to bed at nighttime. And then it reduces at night where there's no, as there's no sunlight and there's no activity. So we don't move, there's no light. The sense of wakefulness, the circadian body clock goes down, the sense of wakefulness, until we wake up again when we start to move and we have sunlight, and then it goes up. Now, these two factors, they go together. So if you see in this graph here, sleep pressure and wakefulness increase during the day. And at some point in the evening, the sleep pressure is so big, it actually is larger than the sense of wakefulness. And once the sleep pressure, the level of adenosine is larger than the wakefulness, the sense of wakefulness, then we fall asleep. And then we have the bedtime. And as the more we sleep, the adenosine level is going down, until it is actually lower than our sense of wakefulness. And then the circle repeats. I hope this is being clear, listening, and the 24-hour circadian rhythm. Those are two factors that are quite important that we need to work with when it comes to sleeping better. Now, another factor that has been shown to be quite important for people with insomnia, people that don't sleep well, is the insomnia worry cycle. So what tends to happen, of course, especially for people with tinnitus, is that if you go to a quiet environment, you tend to notice the tinnitus more because there are less sounds around. Once you notice the tinnitus more, you start to be thinking about the tinnitus, the fact that it's very loud. So for example, you might think, I will never get to sleep with the tinnitus being so loud, especially if the tinnitus initially hindered your sleep. Then you're likely to be starting to think that the tinnitus really is going to undermine your sleep. Now, if one starts to worry about sleeping and thinking that one is not going to sleep this night, then it's going to be a factor that is going to be arousing us. And this will increase our sense of wakefulness. It's not going to affect adesonin, but it's going to affect the arousal and therefore the 24-hour body clock. We'll start to feel anxious. This anxiety will feed back into the negative thoughts. And these negative thoughts then might then also trigger unhelpful behaviors, such as twisting and turning, such as starting to take out an iPad, reading in bed, various things that we might do in order to cope with the fact that we're not sleeping in bed. And many of these behaviors might actually feed back into us sleeping not very well. If this is a bit fast, I'll talk more about this when it comes to how to manage with insomnia, what to do about it. But those were basically the factors that we've been keeping an eye on: the 24-hour body clock, the sleep drive, and the tinnitus insomnia cycle. Now, let's think about the things that can help us with sleep. And here are various factors that I'm going to talk about. They include sleep hygiene, stimulus control, bedtime restriction, a worry list, a thought diary, relaxation, sound therapy, and sleep divorce. Now, you might be thinking about what does he mean by sleep divorce, but I'll talk about that. I'll mention a few things about that in a moment. So, sleep hygiene. Actually, before I talk about what the details, what are the details in these components, I'll just mention that, and Fabrice has already mentioned that we did a study at University College London, and I was one of the co-authors. This was conducted in our department, where we tried to see, do these factors, the ones that I've just shown you before, do they have an impact on people who are suffering from insomnia, who also have tinnitus? Now, we know that these factors are important and effective means of reducing insomnia in individuals who do not have tinnitus. What we tried to work out was, can we use these techniques also for people who have tinnitus and insomnia? And ultimately, it did work. Now, what we did was we did a randomized control trial. So this is kind of a gold standard means of testing an intervention. What happens is that you randomly allocate individuals, in this case, of course, people with insomnia and tinnitus, to different groups. And we see what happens when they get allocated to those different groups. So one of the groups here got what was a social support intervention, seeing whether if we get people together to talk, to help them make connections with other people who are suffering from the same thing and exchange information, exchange tips, does this help people with insomnia? Another group was relaxation. So letting people just practice relaxation techniques in order to help them with insomnia. In fact, I say relaxation, this was one of the components, but they also had information on sleep architecture and sleep hygiene. So it wasn't completely relaxation only. In fact, we called it standard care. So what people might be offered if they go to a specialist hospital and they talk to an audiologist or hearing therapist, what do they get offered? And this is what we had in another group. The third group was the CBT-I intervention. And this is just had the components that I just showed you before, that included bedtime restriction and worry management and thought diaries. What we found was that this intervention was very effective. So it had a meaningful impact for more than 80% of people who were in our study. People in this group got almost 1 hour more sleep per night. And they also even though that wasn't the main focus of our study, showed a significant reduction how much they were actually distressed by their tinnitus. So the question here, or the question that we could answer, was that if we just focus on sleep, if we get people to sleep better, they're actually less worried about their tinnitus, and not just are they sleeping better. And perhaps the idea here is that actually better sleep helps with getting used or finding tinnitus less stressful. Now, let's talk about the components of this intervention. And I should add, of course, that all of these interventions are present in TinniBot. So you will be able to use TinniBot to help you along this journey of better sleep management and hopefully better sleep. One of the components is sleep hygiene. So what do we mean by sleep hygiene? It's setting up your environment in a way so that it's conducive to good night's sleep. And that includes some factors that are to do with your bedroom. Is the temperature right? Most people like sleeping when it's very warm. The evidence actually suggests that it's better sleep is when the room is actually slightly colder. It needs to be dark to help the melatonin production. Lifestyle factors also can have a significant impact on our ability to sleep. So caffeine, for example, how much coffee do we drink, how much tea, Coca-Cola, chocolate. Caffeine has a half-life of about 5 hours. So about 5 hours after you consume coffee, half of it is still in your bloodstream. What does caffeine do? It actually limits the adenosine receptors. So the adenosine will be blocked. You won't feel tired if you drink caffeine. That's what happens. Alcohol also has been shown repeatedly in many studies to disrupt sleep, even if some people have the experience that if they drink a bit of alcohol, then they fall asleep quicker, and this seems to be true, but it interrupts sleep and it actually makes your sleep not as good. So it's not as regenerative and as it would be otherwise without alcohol. Now, diet, big meals shortly before you go to bed are generally not helpful. Exercise is something that is effective for better sleep, but not in the hours before you're actually trying to sleep. So that is one of the issues that one should be keeping an eye on when it comes to sleep. The next component is stimulus control. So what is stimulus control? Now, stimulus control is a very old idea, and it comes from a study done on dogs, Pavlov's dogs. So what did Pavlov do? He had, and in this little diagram here, you'll see 4 boxes. So before conditioning, we have a bowl of food presented to dogs. And if the dogs see the bowl of food, they start to produce saliva, because the dogs associate food with eating and the production of saliva to digest the food, with this positive. So already the digestion of the food is being triggered by the bowl of food. A bell, if one just was to ring a bell, would cause no reaction in the dog. And why would the bell produce a reaction in the dog? During the conditioning, what happens is that the bowl of food is always presented at the same time as a bell is rung. So these two things go together, ringing of the bell and the food presentation. And after this is done for several times, just ringing the bell produces saliva in the dog, because the dog has associated the ringing of the bell with being fed. So what we have done is we've conditioned the bell to produce the production of saliva. Now, why am I talking about the production of saliva in foods and bells when we are really wanting to talk about sleep? The reason is that for most people who don't sleep well, they have lost this connection between being in bed and sleeping. Yeah. Poor sleepers actually spend a lot of time awake in bed. They use the bed for all sorts of things, reading, watching TV, texting, all various sorts of things you might end up doing in bed other than sleeping. So the bed no longer cues you into sleep. And so for good sleepers, what tends to happen is they go to bed and very quickly, maybe some of you may attest that from partners, the person goes to bed and within minutes they're asleep. Now what's happening is that the body and the brain is associating the bed with sleep, just like the dog is hearing the bell and is producing saliva. For individuals that sleep well, the bed is starting out these processes that will send us off to sleep, producing those brain waves that ultimately will send us off into sleep. So this is something that we need to try and get back to, the association between being in bed and sleeping. How do we do that? Well, to keep the bed restricted for sleep only, not doing anything else in bed. Only go to bed when you feel sleepy. Now, when we don't sleep well, we may quickly start to be thinking about, well, I haven't slept very well. Let me go to bed. I need the extra rest. Now, in the ideal world, that will mean that when you go to bed, you fall asleep. But that is not actually what seems to be happening. People are going to bed, but then they're not sleeping. And they're spending a lot of time in bed when they're actually awake, not asleep. And this breaks this link, this conditioning between being in bed and sleeping. Now, another thing that might happen is that when you don't sleep well, people feel obviously not very well during the day. They feel very tired, very sleepy. They start sleeping during the day to catch up with the lost sleep. Now, that tends to work actually quite well for most people, which obviously suggests that people can sleep. They just don't sleep at the time when they want to sleep. But we want to break that association. We want to actually move it to the night. Another thing that we would try and do in order to achieve this stimulus control is to get up at the time, regardless of how you've slept. So this to undermine getting up, staying in bed just because we haven't slept all night and we sleep in a little bit in the morning. So it's really making sure that you have a very fixed time of when you go to bed and when you get up. That seems to be key. There's something that we call a 10 to 20 minute rule. And ultimately, the idea is that if you're not asleep within 10 or 20 minutes, stop trying to sleep. And only try to sleep again when you feel really tired. Now, traditionally, the idea here is to actually leave the bed when you're not asleep and do something else for a while, and then come back to bed when you are now feeling that, okay, now is really the time when I really could sleep. That's when you try and sleep again. It's a little bit like when you think about old computers. They get hung up. They don't move. The computer's thinking. Nothing happens. You have to restart the computer. For most people, if they are not asleep after 20 minutes, if you ask them, or if you ask yourself after 20 minutes, could you read a little bit of something? You will find that actually you're quite awake. You have no problem reading a few pages in a book. You're not that tired. And if you're not that tired, then there would also be no point for you to try to sleep. Only try to sleep when you're really tired. And if you're not sleeping after 20 minutes, it's not clear whether you would lie there for another 5 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, or maybe 2 hours. It's not clear. So we would suggest actually for a moment or for a while, stop trying to sleep and then try again. This is also very important in terms of reducing how much we worry about sleep or not sleeping. So what I would like us to do now is do a little, fill out a little question that I've prepared. And Fabrice will share in the chat a link that allows you to answer 2 questions. So on an average night, how many hours do you spend in bed? And on an average night, how many hours are you asleep in bed?
So there's a link in the chat where you can click on the link, and it will bring you to a browser where you would be able to answer to this question, and we should be able to see the results evolving in live.
Okay, I think you're able to see the results. We'll wait a little bit longer for people to give their answer. So actually at the moment, we see 6.9 hours on average of sleep, which is actually fairly close to what might be recommended. So between 7 and 8 hours. Just wait a few more moments.
Can we see the number of participants, Florian, in the screen?
Not unless I go out.
On this curve, like there no possibility to.
Oh,
I think
I think there may be 14.
Okay, yeah,
14
it's like a
answers.
good distribution already. I think it might already give us a good idea of.
Yeah. So, let me just try this. Okay. So, let's imagine here. We have distribution here. If I click on this, okay. So let's take this as our final answer. So hours spent in bed, 8.8 hours spent in bed, of which actually only 7.1 hours are being slept. So why am I interested in this? Well, I'll go back to my presentation. Which is here. So the reason that I was asking about this was that to calculate what is our sleep efficiency or the sleep efficiency of everybody who's on this call, which essentially the question is what percentage of the time that you're in bed are you actually sleeping? And that's about, having looked at the numbers here, which was about 8.8 and 7.1, it's about 80% sleep efficiency. So that's not actually very bad. So 80% of the time, on average, the people in this call are actually asleep when they are in bed. And generally speaking, what you want to do is to reduce the time in bed when your sleep efficiency is lower than 85%. So on average, everybody in this call should be spending less time in bed. That will be one of the pieces of advice from this call. Now, why is that? Well, basically, people who don't sleep well, they spend a lot of time in bed, but are actually awake. They have poor sleep efficiency. And now, what we're trying to, with regards to that stimulus control, is to reduce the time that we are awake in bed as far as possible, to get the sleep efficiency up, to get the association between being in bed and sleep really, really close. Yes. Also, what we find is that by restricting the time in bed, yes, so on average, let's say here, if we ask people to spend half an hour less in bed, then what doesn't tend to happen is that actually we'd see the sleep time also reduced by half an hour. What we see is that actually, certainly at the beginning, certainly after a few days, maybe a few weeks, is that even though we spend less in bed, the amount of time that we are sleeping stays the same. And as you've seen in our trial, what happened after this trial is actually people sleep more. Even though we have restricted the time in bed. And the reason is that the link between being in bed and sleeping has become very strong, so that for people, when they go to bed, they're very tired and they link the bed automatically with being asleep, and they fall asleep much more quickly. Now, the idea is that when you do that, when you restrict the time in bed, you try and keep that up for, say, a week. And then you try and reduce the time that you're in bed for. You keep that, and your body is likely to adjust to that, and your sleep is going to become more efficient. And when it is, say, 90%, then you can already spend a bit more time in bed again, seeing whether your sleep efficiency stays the same or whether it gets worse again. So that would be one of the things to look out for. How much time are you in bed, and how much of that time are you asleep? If there's a big difference, our advice is to spend less time in bed. Bedtime restriction, ultimately. A worry list. So another component that we had in the trial was to compile a worry list. So rather than going to bed and then spending time in bed thinking about what we are going to do tomorrow, or the things that we haven't managed to do during the day, is to set some time aside towards the evening to actually think about some of the problems that have come up, and maybe think already about some of the first steps that you might could do either the next day or that week. Now, getting it down, written down, is generally a way of getting it out of your mind. Now, we can do that on paper, or you can also use the Tinnitus app. And there's a place for that in the app to do that. Not everybody finds that useful. Not everybody does that, but you may be somebody who actually benefits from doing that. Another component that we used in the trial that we think is very important is relaxation. So getting a regular relaxation routine into your day to reduce arousal and worry. And this is something that actually many people have tried, are doing, is that they may use some relaxation techniques, some breathing techniques, such as light meditation in bed, and it helps them to fall asleep. Now, this is not a guarantee. It might not send you off to sleep, but in general, it has shown that this seems to be an effective technique. Like I said, in our trial, we just asked people to do some relaxation and spend some time thinking about setting their bedroom up and setting their bed up in the right place, such as removing light sources, regulating the temperature. That was already an effective change, doing some relaxation, and those fairly basic changes, it improved people's sleep. So if you're not doing that yet, but have difficulty with sleep, then you should be considering to do some relaxation. Now, the next thing is the vicious cycle of worry regarding sleep and tinnitus. Now, I already mentioned a little bit about that. Now, imagine a situation. You're awake in bed. The tinnitus is very loud. what are you likely to think? This is very likely that you think something like, I won't sleep tonight. I won't cope tomorrow if I don't sleep any minute now. You might even think, I must sleep. Now, if you think like that, you're very likely to also be experiencing some negative emotions, such as anxiety, some hopelessness, a sense of helplessness. And this anxiety will cause physiological responses. The anxiety and the thoughts will cause some physiological responses in your body that will undermine sleep. So muscles will become tense and there's going to be physiological arousal, something that you will not be wanting in order for you to achieve the best possible sleep. Now, on top of thinking negatively, feeling stressed, the body being aroused, you might also engage in several behaviors that might undermine your ability to fall asleep. And that might include checking the clock various times, checking how long am I awake. And then once you check the clock, you might find that actually, oh my God, I'm not sleeping. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. What is that going to do? Well, it's going to make you think more negatively about sleep. It might make you think, if I really am not going to sleep now, tomorrow is going to be awful. That might actually make you think that you have to change what you do the next day. Maybe you start to make plans about meetings that you will cancel or things that you're not going to do, like going for a walk because you haven't slept that well, you don't want to stress your body. And all of these behaviors are actually likely to interfere more with your worry about sleep, this idea that I really have to sleep because that's going to affect my day. And there's this interaction between behaving in a certain way and thinking negatively that where one can feed into the other, which ultimately increases the tension and arousal in your body, continuously undermining your sleep. This may be a process that actually already starts before you go to bed. So for many people who have difficulties with sleep, before they even go to bed, they are thinking about the nightmare that they're going to have at night. And obviously thinking that it is going to undermine ability to be calm and to ease yourself into sleep. What do we do about this? Well, in our study, the key idea here is to be aware of the thoughts about sleep and tinnitus. Now, I've put a few thoughts here that many people with insomnia share when it comes to sleep. So it could be that this insomnia is going to have serious consequences on my physical health. When I feel irritable, depressed, or anxious during the day, it's mostly because I don't sleep well the night before. Without adequate night's sleep, I can hardly function the next day. I feel that insomnia is ruining my ability to enjoy life and prevents me from doing what I want. Tinnitus is stopping me from falling asleep. Now, these are quite common thoughts for people to have, and they may or may not be true. So what is important is that many of the thoughts that we have regarding tinnitus, regarding sleep, may not be very helpful, and there may be different perspectives that we can take on the situation that might be helpful to us. So, for example, one might have to think about this idea about whether we can really function the next day if I haven't slept very well. Now, one of the things that we studied is that actually what happens when we restrict people's sleep is that actually they function quite well. And many people are quite surprised that actually they maybe don't really notice the difference if we actually restrict their sleep as much as they thought it would. So there might be an awareness that actually there have been days where I functioned quite well, even though I didn't sleep very well the night before or the previous few nights. And maybe there's days that you can think back where you didn't sleep very well, but actually you functioned quite well. So it's important to keep in mind that actually some of these thoughts they may seem very true. They may describe the only reality that is, but with closer inspection, there may be a different way of thinking about these situations. And if there's a different way of thinking about the situations, then this can help to ease the anxiety that we feel about sleeping or not sleeping. And in Tinnitus, you have a function of actually going through your thoughts, questioning your thoughts, exploring some of the cognitive biases or thinking biases that we may fall prey to, and really paying attention to what it is that I'm thinking about sleep and developing a different way of thinking about sleep that may be more helpful for me. So that you can find in the Tinnitus app. Now, this kind of brings me to the end, and then we have time for questions. Now, there may be some reasons for you to see a doctor, which may not have anything to do with insomnia as such. So if you present with extreme fatigue during the day, if you snore loudly with pauses in breathing, either something you've noticed yourself or a partner, if you have very frequent morning headaches, or you're falling asleep at appropriate times, such as sitting on the table or driving, then there may be an underlying sleep difficulty that doesn't have something to do with insomnia, but maybe with sleep apnea. And in that case, you should be talking to your doctor to have that investigated. Now that brings me to the end of the presentation, and I'd like to thank you all for sitting through this talk, and I hope you gained some insights from what I was communicating.